Jasenia, we are going to be recording. Great. Yeah. So
oh, yes, thank you. I just turned on the recording.
Yeah. So welcome everybody. Jasenia, thanks for that intro. And we will be sharing the recording with people who signed up and weren't able to make it live. So hi, everyone. My name is Alethea Chang Fitzpatrick, she, her, hers. I'm the principal and founder of Co-Creating Inclusion. Really excited to be here with you all and to catch up with our panelists today who participated in our workshop series. And so we did jump on early, but I was like, let's not have the conversation yet. Like, I'm really excited to hear their answers to the questions I have about their takeaways and what they put into practice at their firms with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're going to start out with introductions, but not so much our professional bios, although our panelists are welcome to include some of that as well. But what we often do in DEI work to co-create inclusion is to share just some of our identity stories and aspects of our identity that maybe we wouldn't typically lead with when we are introducing ourselves. So I am going to go first with that. So as I said, Alethea Chang Fitzpatrick, she, her, hers, and I am a British-born Chinese American. And it's only in the last few years of my life that I have sort of started introducing myself that way, or even identified how I want to describe myself. For much of my life, I was always sort of faced with boxes to check off that didn't really feel like they fit me. And certainly in typical professional settings, I would not necessarily lead with that, but it does also feel kind of liberating to just name it. So identify as a woman of color, I'm cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, and sort of privileged in most of those other dimensions other than race and gender. I'm married. I have 2 boys who are 10 and 12. And so I was born in London, grew up in the south of England, and came to New York City after high school. So I've been here ever since. I live in Brooklyn. I'm a former architect, so I practiced architecture and interior design for almost 20 years in New York City before becoming, through a variety of twists and turns, a DEI consultant. I am a creative at heart, and what I discovered is that I love working with organizations to shift culture towards equity and inclusion. So for me, in a way, people and organizations are more of my creative medium than buildings and spaces. Although, of course, buildings and spaces are really important play a really important role in our culture and can have a huge impact. It just wasn't quite the medium for me. So with that, I'm going to hand over. Who on our panel would like to go next in an introduction? Lauren?
I guess I'll go. Oh,
yeah, go ahead.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Lauren Coughlin. I identify as female. I grew up in the sleepy suburbs of Bucks County, Pennsylvania, very local to Philadelphia. I'm sure everybody, well, maybe not everybody, but most of you know where that is. I also have, I'm married, have 2 children, and sheesh, what else can I share about myself? I guess, you know, I came to these panels because really interested in, you know, understanding other cultures, just other individuals, you know, different perspectives and things like that. It's always been awesome to me to connect with people that are not like myself. So getting the tools to really have some good conversations with others and inspire others to do the same. So that is how I landed here today. Did I miss anything?
That's great. Thanks, Lauren. I think it's helpful for everyone to just kind of like know how we identify a little bit of background. Who wants to go next from the panel?
I'll go next. Robby Prall, he, him, his, and I am the brand identity director at D2. So dealing a lot with brand strategy and thinking about culture in general. I grew up in a predominantly white suburban neighborhood. All my life, went to a very small rural school for college, and then moved to Washington, D.C. to start my career. And I think it was there that I really just loved being around different people and absorbing different cultures and experiences. And it really opened my eyes up to world outside of my small zone here in Reading, but recently moved back to the area and joined up with D2. So again, like Lauren, I was really excited to be a part of the panel and just broaden my horizons more and see how I can work on some more personal growth.
Great. Thanks, Robbie. Alex?
And then saving the best for last.
Mhm.
We're all great. I'm Alexandra Bonner. Pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a Philadelphia. Well, first I identify as a Black woman, first and foremost, and then I am a wife, a daughter, a sister, a cat mom, a chocolate lover, a travel enthusiast. I like the color of yellow. I'm a Libra, et cetera, et cetera. I'm from Philly, West Philly, born and raised. I have the honor and pleasure to still be here in my career. I did spend some time going to school in Cleveland, Ohio, so I've always been in pretty culturally diverse communities. Fortunately for me, I know going off to a small private art college for my college education was the first time I was, introduced to more narrow-minded and, for lack of a better term, kind of racist experiences. So I've had my share of those interactions in my life, and now working in a predominantly white industry, I definitely serve as an advocate for people of color in our design industry. I'm always volunteering. I've got a lot of experience with our local IIDA board, and I'm also really involved with any and every volunteer opportunity I can, so I can advocate for design, especially in communities where it's not necessarily considered a traditional path for a career. So I'm here today just to continue my ability to advocate, and I'm excited for everyone that's here and in this space looking to learn tonight.
Thanks, Alex. Great to have you all here. And I do want to invite everyone in the audience. I don't think we have time for everyone to introduce themselves, but if you want to just post in the chat, just to introduce yourselves and share whatever you would like to about yourselves. It would be great to sort of see who else is in the room. So why don't we give people a couple minutes to just post a quick introduction in the chat.
Don't be shy. We want tonight to feel more collaborative. For names that look familiar, I may be tempted to just put you on the spot. Like Jane, I see you're in the Jane Allen. Feel free to tell us something about yourself.
Melanie, born in Australia and lived in 7 countries. Thanks for sharing that. Jesenia, first generation Hispanic female, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, pop mom. We've got Katie in Pittsburgh, director of design for Franklin Interiors, interested in diversifying the pool of interior designers. MJ Davino, Filipino American in New Jersey, chair of interior design program at Keene University and architect as well. Carol, born in a small town of predominantly Italian immigrants. I've grown up in quite a diverse world and continue to do so. Jen Sullivan with Mohawk, moved to Philly in 2002 from Arizona, born in northwestern Minnesota. Mom and grandma, not sure of nationality. Welcome, everybody. Leslie, born and raised in northern New Jersey. Grew up in all major white town and 1 Black family. Went to FSU in Tallahassee, and my eyes opened up. Yeah, I think my family was one of, I think, 3 non-white families in the town I grew up. Jean from Plainfield, New Jersey, now in Richmond, Virginia. Principal and director of HR at your firm, involved with 2 JEDI groups, AI on your office, mother, sister, wife. Love hearing all of these details. Jane grew up in central Pennsylvania, spent the last 10 plus years in Pittsburgh, and now focusing on material health, native plants, and training for half marathons. That is a very interesting collection of interests. hopefully I didn't miss anyone. Michael Spain, Director of Design Education.
Hey, Mike Spain.
What do you say?
I said, hey, Mike Spain.
Oh,
Hey, Mike.
former colleague of Robbie and Lauren. Yes, have partners with Alexandra. Great to see you all. Yeah. Robin, born in Philadelphia, raised as Italian American, remained in the area, now in the suburbs. Worked as interior designer for over 30 years, married with 3 grown daughters. Larice, raised on Navajo res until 21 years in Africa, mother and managed a 3-generational household. So we've got some quite interesting different backgrounds for people here as well. So welcome everyone. And we do have a 4th virtual remote a panel participant who actually was not able to be here, but she did record a video. Liz, hi Liz, grew up in Bucks County, now called Philly my home. Also here to support diversity in our design community in any way I can. So yes, we really appreciate all of you being here. And we have a nice, I feel like often when my team is delivering work, we've got like a very strict agenda and a lot of content to get through. Today is nice because we're just kind of here to chat. So also anyone in the audience, think about questions that you may have at the panel as well. But I do want to mention that Stacey was not able to be live, but she did want to be part of the panel. So she recorded a video. So Sunny, are you ready to play that?
Yes, I'll share my screen. Yeah, so we have Stacey Hollander, Maine, partner at RLPS, who's going to share just about a 2 to 3 minute video of her takeaways and how her place of work has changed up some of their practices, surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion.
We cannot hear the volume.
One second.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Stacey Hollander, Maine, and I am a partner at RLPS Architects in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We do both senior living, K-12, and higher education. And I'm really glad to be part of this discussion with you today. I had the opportunity to be part of the panel a few months ago, and it was really a great takeaway for me to make sure that, one, our company was doing the right things for diversity, equity, inclusion. And it really gave me a few other ideas that I could share with the rest of the team here at RLPS. The reason I took the class was because I had an intern face me with a question I didn't quite know how to answer. It was wonderful to be able to have that discussion, but from a young person's perspective, it really allowed me to think about people, individuals, and how they view themselves, and being open and honest and celebrating the differences that we all have in life. One of the things that we've done at RLPS is to take another look at our employee policy manual. So we wrote in a whole new section regarding diversity, equity, inclusion. We've also identified in that policy manual that if anybody wants to celebrate a holiday different than those that are identified in our policy manual, that they be able to substitute those. The other things that we've done, we've brought in a workshop to alert the staff on how to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. And even next month, we're bringing in somebody who is identifying with the LGBTQ community and doing roundtable discussions in our office to see how we can look at design differently when we're thinking about DEI, how that might impact our clients, and the way that it's going to impact design for future schools, education facilities, and senior living. Talk to somebody in human resources. Get those people on board. You need a champion at the top I think that's really helped us at RLPS, having some of the talkings happening at the ground level, having somebody in a leadership level kind of push that conversation forward is really impactful. Getting that conversation started and hearing each other, it may alert you to something new that might be on the horizon for you. I wanted to say thank you so much to IIDA, the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware Association, for pulling us all together to having this really important conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So Stacey did a sort of quick, I posed a few questions and so she answered those, but I want to hear from our live panelists as well. So the first question, and I always love to ask this, and we sometimes ask at the end of a workshop, but what for you was some of your biggest takeaways from the workshop series? And so everyone knows we did a talk, I think early in the fall, and then we had a series of 2 workshops in October. So it hasn't been that long since then. So bear that in mind. But yeah, what were, who wants to go first in terms of what some of your takeaways were from those workshops?
I'll jump in.
Great, go ahead.
So I think one of the biggest takeaways was like a practical tip that you had for us toward the end of the second workshop, which was start small. Don't start with a massive overhaul. And that was kind of refreshing and I think took off a lot of pressure, because when Robbie and I first started talking about this, we were honestly, before the workshops, we were staring at each other kind of like, wow, where do we begin with this? What's most important to focus on in the beginning? So it just gave us kind of this more interval, stepping stone approach to how we've talked about DEI since. I think also I had kind of 3 answers to this. So the second one is relating to the oppressive versus inclusive behaviors. So we were given a list of kind of more oppressive behaviors that have kind of become normalized in our country based on, like a white supremacy culture. And they're things that when you look at them, when you first take them in, they're not positive, but they don't seem that bad. But then when you look over to the other side and you see what inclusive behaviors are, so I actually have it here printed out. The first one on the list is perfectionism. Maybe not the worst thing in the world, but a growth mindset is the inclusive behavior, that opposes that. So it was cool for us to see that and we even got some requests from some folks in the office. We've had some conversations since for a printout of that so that people could keep it at their desks as a reminder daily of the things that we should be thinking. So that was a really cool kind of, again, like a tool that we could use. And then the last major takeaway for me was to foster belonging and inclusivity and not immediately focus on diversity. I think that was something that, at this point in time, after going through the workshops, it seems so right to do it that way. But before the workshops, I will shamefully admit that we were approaching it from, we need to promote diversity within the firm and, just generally. And now we realize, okay, so you foster belonging, you foster an inclusive culture, and that supports diversity. So that was a really big one for me.
Lauren, and I'm seeing I was like, people are going to want that list. So yes, we'll figure out some resources that we can send out, we can email afterwards. But it's based on the work of Tema Okun and Kenneth Jones and some other folks. And it's called The Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture, which sounds kind of foreboding. And I always like to say it's not about the KKK, but it's sort of about mainstream culture that privileges white folks. But those are traits that it's not just that white people, like we're all socialized into sort of prioritizing things like perfectionism, as you said, Lauren, but also things like sense of urgency and worship of the written word, defensiveness, power hoarding, fear of conflict. And these are all things that don't sound like they're about race or about identity at all, but help to perpetuate oppression. And so then there's a great sort of list of sort of what you can do instead. Like you said, things like growth mindset or realistic plans, open decision-making, power sharing, all of collaboration, all of those things. So Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Lauren. And I think I'm really glad the diversity point landed because, and just so everyone is clear, it's not that diversity isn't important. Obviously it is, but if you're doing diversity first and you don't have a culture of belonging and inclusion, bringing in people of more diverse talent can in some cases just sort of cause more harm or causes people to feel tokenized or really not give people the chance to succeed if you're not in an environment that is inclusive. That doesn't mean you should actively try to not be diverse, of course, but that if you focus on the inclusion, then diversity becomes something that kind of can more naturally happen. Before we go to Alex, Robbie, because you're at the same firm, do you want to add on to that? And maybe you could talk a little bit about what your and Lauren's role is in DEI at your firm. Like, are you
Sure.
on an official committee? Is it part of your role? Is it a volunteer? Like, maybe you can explain for folks that. And also anyone in the audience, if you have questions, you can post them in the chat or just raise a digital hand and we can call on you as well. So Robbie, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. We started as a committee, just putting some action into place in the workplace. I think it kind of came naturally to Lauren and I because me working in brand strategy and her in culture in the workplace, it just kind of felt like a natural fit for us to kind of take the reins and educate ourselves on this. So we put together a committee of are there 5 people, Lauren, about?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And we just started the discussion with, how are we going to get started? What things should we do? And looking back on our initial list, it's kind of comical, like Lauren said. I think that we were looking at very surface level. And, now that we've kind of dug our hands in and learned so much more, I think one of my biggest takeaways was just how little that we really knew and how we were approaching it, especially as Lauren said, approaching it more from that, like, oh, well, let's just, hire some diversity and, look at the employee manual. And now we're looking at it way more in depth. And one of the big changes I've noticed just personally in myself is just being more of an observer throughout the day and trying to pick up cues on how people are interacting when new employees come on, how are they being trained, how are they being approached. It's really shedded light in a way to me and how I'm just seeing things and picking up on some areas that I think are weaknesses that we can address. So I'm really excited to move forward now that we have more context and understanding and try to put some more meaningful approach to it.
Robbie, thanks. That's great to hear. And I see a question from the audience about if panelists could mention the demographics of their firms. So Robbie and Lauren, we'll come back to you, but let's go to Alex. And maybe Alex, you could talk, I think you did already talk about a little bit about that, but yes, what are the demographics like at your firm and what were your big takeaways from the workshops?
Yep, for sure. And I know I do have maybe a colleague or two in the audience right now virtually, so that's awesome. But in terms of demographics, and I don't have like exact data, but at least in my work experience, it's my firm currently.
Oh, I think you got muted by mistake.
That would be all 3 books that I have of all my notes, and I just like lean forward and I press on the keyboard. So there's that. Don't have it quite underway after 3 years of this stuff. So anywho, just in terms of cultural demographics, I find that our firm is culturally diverse in comparison to other firms that I've worked at. In the grand scheme of like larger scale, our firm is also about 110 people in total. So I know that looks different based on the size of your firm, just in terms of like what's even feasible in that representation. So in terms of demographics for MJ's question, I feel like I don't know, Alethea, what do we think is the best way to approach answering this?
Well, I'll sort of say, is it predominantly white? About what percentage are not white? Is it predominantly male? Maybe what percentage women? And what does that look like sort of as you go into leadership levels? Because often there is more diversity sort of at the early career stages.
Okay,
So
that
those
helps
are
me.
usually the two. I mean, obviously there's a lot more that goes into diversity, but it's much harder
Of
to
course.
measure other dimensions. So those are the two things that are sort of easiest to name, at least.
I definitely think for firms of the size our firm is here in Philadelphia, like it's not too uncommon from other firms. So a lot of the leadership at the principal level is predominantly male and white. I think there's maybe 3 or 4 female principals and then one person of color at the leadership level. It gets a little more culturally inclusive when you get down to the next step, like in terms of senior associates and associates, but even then, like, and I can speak to Black professionals because that's obviously what I identify with culturally in the firm altogether. There's maybe, it's gotten better, I will say, since when we started all these conversations, we have hired more Black professionals, but it always comes back to the pipeline issue, which we're not necessarily set up to talk about this evening, but you're going to have a less culturally diverse company because there's less of a cultural diversion in terms of who's going to school to pursue these careers and then who's like exposed to these careers at an earlier age and so on and so on. So I think there's under 10 Black employees at my firm, but for the size and in my experience, it's not necessarily like that's better than what I've experienced at other firms. We do have people of Asian identities and Hispanic, and then probably even identities I don't realize are even like represented at the firm. So that's kind of my rough overview on demographics there. And then if I were to jump back in terms of takeaways, sorry, you were going to say something.
I was going to say, how about for women and men across the firm?
I feel like the woman and male part is pretty more equal, but leadership definitely leans more in terms of project managers. It leans more towards men for sure. And then women are more so staff or project level professional.
Okay, great. Hopefully that answers the question. Do you have other sort of affinity groups like LGBTQ or
So
is that
after,
something how you kind of get a sense?
yeah, and our firm's one of the firms that definitely, after George Floyd was murdered, went and started an EDI group, and we're taking it in bite-sized pieces. And I myself and several others are a part of this group. And then initially we wanted to focus because people were saying, okay, well, if we're going to have diversity, we need to look at women, we need to look at LGBTQ, we need to look at all of these other things. And we wanted to take a step back and focus primarily on Black and brown representation at first, and then we are actually putting into action now just some concepts to create other task force where there is a place for everybody to have a space at the table, because we do recognize that ultimately to be truly inclusive, we do need to create space at the table for everyone, but we have to focus on one thing at a time. A little bit often equals a lot.
Yes, no, I think quite often with firms, it's often the women who organize first, and then LGBTQ, and then around race, just because we're so socialized to not talk about race. So I actually really am in support of it kind of being the other way around, because I think if you look at race and you look at Black and brown folks, like that, like all of these different systems of oppression are intertwined. So if you can start to address race and then also think about, well, what about women of color? What about LGBTQ folks? Like you can think about intersectionality. So it's not siloed and it's not about the oppression Olympics, but it's really about sort of understanding different needs of all of these different identities. You can really make some headway there. So anyway, sorry to divert a little bit from the question, but yeah, your takeaways.
No, for sure. And I don't have too much new in terms of Lauren and Robbie to add. But I do think that what co-creating was able to provide were resources that I found that were varied. And I'm hoping we are able to share. It wasn't just white fragility, which I feel like is what everybody was saying. Oh, you need to read this. So it's like, okay, and what else? What now? So just in terms of podcasts, and there were PDFs, and there were documentaries that were all shared as resources to look into. And I thought that was really great. And I also really appreciated the Mindful Minute that we did as part of the different workshops, because it's so important, especially with this heavier content, to really take a moment and ease our way. I'm surprised we didn't do a Mindful Minute here this evening, I'll say, but it just helped to have a mental break.
I know, maybe we'll close with one. I feel like everything's talking about here. Everyone's like, oh, I want that too. So yes, we'll put together some resources, and we'll send out some of the things that you work on. Was there a particular resource that you have dived into that you've liked, or you just sort of like having more things that were recommended?
Having a variety of the things. I listened to the podcast and then to PDFs, having things that are tangible. And so it's not so much just one size fits all, because everybody's going to approach things differently. We digest information differently. So that's appreciated.
Yeah, the podcast is Seeing White. So if people want to look that up, I'll try and pull up the link as well. But we'll do a follow-up email and give people some of these resources as well. Okay, great. Robbie and Lauren, do you want to just talk a little bit about the demographics at your firm?
Yeah. So I think in a lot of ways we're similar to Alex's firm. We're about half the size, and in the suburbs. So that's kind of where we differ. But we have our leadership team is we have 3 partners. One's a woman. So our firm has always, and 2 of our partners are married, and they have a child with special needs. I keep backing up to give more information before I say that they've always kind of had this philosophy of supporting family and supporting people in their lives, whatever their paths may be, their challenges and that kind of thing. So I feel like they've kind of built this culture that at least very much supports women. There's always been a lot of flexibility. So at our director and project management level, I would say it's pretty equal parts, 50-50 women and men, primarily white, if not all white. I'm just trying to think of all of our project managers here. And then on our project team levels, we are pretty diverse. I would say just sticking with the gender, we have a variety of disciplines here, as I'm sure most firms like us do. But our interior design group is maybe a little bit heavier female, but it's pretty diverse in terms of men and women. Project managers, 2 are women, 1 is a man, and the teams are equal, I would say. Our architecture team is primarily male, and our engineering team is primarily male. So I feel like that's pretty stereotypical, and it holds true here. And then in terms of racial diversity, we have a number of people who recently, moved to the States. So we have a lot of variety of cultures here. I would say, I don't know, Robbie, correct me if I'm way off, but I would say we're probably 65%, somewhere between 65 and 70% white. So, I mean, it's still dominant, but we're still pretty diverse, I think, especially for being all the way out here in the burbs. And I think that's kind of a struggle sometimes. But that's where we stand, I think. Did I miss anything?
No, I don't think so. I mean, just in branding, which is separate from architecture and interiors in some ways, but we're all integrated as one team. There's a female project manager, another female director, and the 3 of us are kind of the management team on that end. And then we have 2 female designers, a male industrial designer, and then 2 male installers that work on the team as well, and 1 member of the LGBTQ community. So no racial diversity though in branding.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. I think it's good to get a picture and some context. I think often in design firms, both it can feel a lot more white than it is. So sometimes, right, I think there's often a culture of sort of assimilation or not talking about race. And you may have people who don't identify as white, but don't really talk about it, and may not even, right, Alex, you sort of said identities that you may not even be aware of. And at the same time, I think we know Black and Latinx folks are particularly underrepresented. And there are also still barriers to Asian folks in terms of access to leadership. So there's definitely a lot of work to be done. And Lauren, as you said, it's not necessarily the place to start in terms of sort of responsibly being able to cultivate diversity. Like I think it's often there's often anxiety of like, oh, like we look so white, we're so white, it doesn't look good on the website, people can tell and people can see. And so sometimes the focus on diversity is sort of like out of an anxiety to look good. And I think that's just something to be cautious about, because you want to be authentic and you want to diversify in a way that isn't causing more harm, rather than just kind of thinking about how it looks. Let's move on. And I did see some questions around pipeline. So let's see if we can get into a bit more of a discussion about pipeline in a little bit. But I want to hear how you all have been putting those takeaways that you just shared with us into practice at your firm, or what are some other actions that you've taken since the workshops?
I'll get started. I know Lauren and I are going to have some overlapping, so I'll just give one and then pass it off to Lauren so she can continue the conversation. But really the first thing that we did after the workshop was Lauren and I got together and compiled our notes, talked, had good, open, honest conversation about how we felt and where we needed to go. And then we got together within our group and had a session where we shared within the DEI group our perspectives and what we had learned. And it was great. I think that everyone really got an eye-opening look into the topics that we had discussed and some of the strategies that we had discussed. And that just, I think, got everyone even more excited and energized and looking forward to taking next steps with a little more direction. Because I think we all felt that stress of not knowing where to start before this, and having Lauren and I, although we're not by no means experts, having at least some footing to get that conversation going, I think was a relief to us.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And really, I mean, my response would be very similar to Robbie's. You know, we've just been talking and kind of having small circle conversations. I've had a number of conversations with our director of operations and our partners just about, you know, little bits and pieces of takeaways from the workshops, nothing really kind of formalized yet at this point, but it's just been coming up in conversations, which I think has been really successful, and everybody's been really open to having the chats. So that's good. And, you know, it's been, like you said, when we started, it hasn't been all that long. And we've, I think all of the local firms are feeling the deadline driven nature reality these days. We've been so busy, all that work that wasn't happening is happening. So it's now that I'm jumping into challenges, but I think that's why we're kind of just stuck at these conversational moments, because it's been a little tough to find the time, you know, go back to that oppressive chart.
Yes. Let's talk a little bit more about that. But tell me, either one of you, a little bit more about the stress of, so you didn't know where to start, and then you took the workshop, and then it sounds like you had some ideas about where to start. So what was the sort of, where should we start? Is it the conversations? Like, was there anything, was that sort of we should start with conversations?
Well, I think yes, it's conversations, and it's just building awareness and sharing, you know, just sharing our major takeaways. And it's also, Robbie kind of mentioned, he's been observing. And that's one thing that we have, I feel like I'm jumping way ahead in these questions, but it is one thing that we have kind of on our task list for the year, is to kind of really, really observe a lot and do kind of a deep dive audit and see where we have the most challenges or the biggest challenges, and really address those zones. So we don't have like a formalized plan necessarily after the workshops, but it gave us, like Robbie said, a footing is a really good way to put it, because, you know, we actually feel like we kind of know what we're doing at this point. Did I answer that well enough, Robbie?
Yeah. Yep, you're good.
That's great. Alex, how about you?
Definitely something that, and it's ironic that this word seems to be coming up a lot now, is authenticity. So one of my initial thoughts, even before going into the workshops and the training, is when we go back to 2020 and firms were posting squares and all of this stuff. And it's like, is that really authentic to who the firm is? And if you were a firm posting something and then you didn't have any people of color on your website, then it was like, okay, that like a interesting moment. So I've always moved from a place out of authenticity, or at least I've tried. What I think has been helpful or takeaways to come back from the workshops my firm is the industry is like doing a lot of informing that the principals and the leaders are already seeing for themselves. So it's almost making it easier to put things out on the table for them to see, because we have clients coming back to us and they're adding positions to their firms for DEI professionals, or they're making promotions and there's more people of color just moving to the forefront within their organization. So it points a finger back at us to then realize, okay, we need to be making some moves so that we are better able to reflect what our clients are coming to us with. So I definitely feel like, in my experience, we've been fortunate enough that the industry is starting to hold the leaders in our firm especially accountable in ways where it's almost solving itself. Obviously, it's going to take time. That's another thing that I take away from the workshop, and in reality is it has not been long, but we're going to need time to actually make these changes and make them in an authentic and lasting way.
Great, thanks, Alex. I'm curious, does it feel more authentic now than maybe it did originally in reaction to the murder of George Floyd? And what makes it feel more authentic if it does?
For me, things feel more authentic when the firm is ready to put money behind it. It costs nothing to post on social media, right? But when you're able to, our firm actually, even prior to IIDA having this workshop, hired an EDI professional to come in and to do some training with us, and putting money behind having memberships with NOMA, the National Organization of Minority Architects. When you start to put money behind it, because money talks, that to me helps it to feel like, okay, we're not just talking.
Great, thanks, Alex. What have been some of the successes and lessons learned? And again, it hasn't been that long since the workshop, but even in the short time since the workshop, is there anything that you would sort of do differently, even rewinding a couple of months?
I think one thing that I would do differently is, although I think we've had success with these kind of small circle conversations and, just kind of making it a regular part of our dialogue, I think I would feel a little bit better about the time since the workshops if we had a more formalized conversation. And, just something to sit down and show, the gravity of, what we learned and why it's so important and that kind of thing. We didn't do that, and it's definitely not too late, but I would feel like we were in a better place right now if we had. So that I think is something that I would have done differently, just pushed forward on that. We kind of similarly to what Alex was saying, we also had some training, which I think I mentioned in the workshops. It was more leadership training. It was not necessarily focused on DEI, but one thing I realized after going through the workshops is how similar the lessons and the tools and the things that we're learning in that training are to the, just the DEI and the philosophy, the inclusive list that you gave us. So I think that that's a success. Just knowing that we're already starting to build a foundation there. And it's something that now we realize just how important it is. It's not just for leadership, it's really for everything, to make us a better place, a better workplace, and better people, better teammates. So I think that's also a success, just identifying that it's so important.
Yeah, and to add to that, and I'll bring this up because Lauren worked really hard on this. We had a Q1 meeting recently that I think, looking at it from a new lens, it was much more of a transparent meeting. It talked openly about company goals, ways that we underachieved, how we're trying to get to new heights together. And it also had a workshop at the end where we discussed kind of like employee wishes for what would make their work life better, their home life better. we worked in groups together to come up with ideas. And the promise was that at the end, the partners and leadership would take in all of the feedback and take action on that. So it was nice. You talked a lot about creating safe spaces in the workshop. So it was nice to see working as a group coming up with these anonymous ideas that we could post up on the board, and then knowing that there was going to be some action taken on those ideas. I just saw a lot of that behavior coming through in that exercise. So, you know, something really small, but in the past, our quarterly meetings were a little more like rah-rah and not so much, a little more surface level and morale building maybe, and not so much having conversations like that. So I thought that was a great step forward.
Robbie. Yeah, and for everyone in the audience, we do talk about how you create that space so people can share. And sometimes it does mean being able to share anonymously, because it's not always, right, again, depending on your identity, it's not always, it doesn't always feel safe, or it's not always as easy for everyone to speak up. You know, not just on race and gender, but even things like whether you're extrovert or introvert, or how long you've been at the firm, or what level you're at. Oftentimes people who speak up are sort of characterized as you know, divisive or angry or complaining or negative. And so being able to create those spaces where people can share their feedback, it can be really hard for leadership to hear that feedback. And that feedback is also incredibly valuable because it's sort of data. If we like to call it data, it's data where we treat it as data, we analyze it as data. This sounds kind of cold, but it's the feedback and input and voices that give you the pointers on what you can shift in order to really create a difference in terms of outcomes for the organization as well as the people within it. So excited to hear that has been happening. Alex, how about you? Successes, lessons learned?
Definitely always looking for lessons learned that I find myself constantly in face of, because sometimes, and I'll be honest, like I'll go into DEI training and I'll think, I don't need to learn anything. I'm already like the minority in the room. But then you're like pleasantly surprised when you realize that there's, again, coming back to what Lauren saying, you got to approach more than just the diversity aspect to be truly inclusive and to be authentically inclusive. And then some of the successes I see that are happening in our firm is really, as leadership is really starting to kind of get it. I think, again, a lot, I'm just repeating some of the things I already said, but they see a lot of it coming from our clients. But when we are seeing, clients are now holding firms more accountable in terms of just being inclusive. And we heard from, so far, our HR person sits on our EDI committee, and she even told us a story about someone who recently applied for a job, and they said, hey, you don't have any diversity on your website. Like, what's that about? So the world is holding a lens up to these firms and to companies behind our A&D industry to just hold us accountable. And I think that's a success that we're all benefiting from in some capacity, for sure.
Yeah, thanks. I've also heard even of, like, you know, at interviews for projects being asked, what are you doing about DEI, or how do you integrate DEI into your work, or, you know, EDI, like there are so many different acronyms. So we tend to use DEI, but I know there are a lot of other ones as well. Yeah, I think it does really impact the bottom line. And as you said, money talks also. And so I do think I was concerned also that the sort of woke wave after the murder of George Floyd was sort of a momentary thing that like everyone sort of participated in, but that there was a performative aspect to it. And, you know, there always is, but with every wave, there are more people who really kind of shift and make that commitment. And we have certainly seen, at least at our firm, we've seen a shift, and that the conversation is becoming more and more mainstream, and companies are holding each other accountable, and it is more a part of what is expected that a firm is doing. So, so that's great. How about, and maybe Alex, while you're talking, like you can keep going. What about some of the challenges or any struggles or anything you want to sort of brainstorm or get feedback from us on?
Not that I have right off the top of my head. I'm sure I like noodle it a little bit for sure. Because I mean, there's always pushback. There's always somebody in the room, even if they aren't as, the ones that are quiet are usually the ones that I get the sense are not comfortable, but there's a hesitancy to speak out because you don't want to seem like you're not going with the times and stuff. So when there is pushback and when there's a hesitancy to serve resources, like I know recently our committee, we have a woman who is an interior designer in my office who's also pursuing a master's in policy right now. So she is working on putting together an actual diversity and inclusion plan for our company. There was an opportunity to present that to the principals and the leaders of the firms, and some of the action items that the committee discussed. There were people that were like, I don't know if we want to have a section on our website that says DEI. So there's always pushback. And so I don't know if there's any examples for either Lauren, Robbie, or anybody within the chat. I'd love to hear any more about any of your experiences with your companies are doing to really walk the walk.
Yeah, Robbie, Lauren, do you have some thoughts on, what kinds of things is your firm doing to show that commitment? So again, I think it's a fine line between being performative and being authentic. But I hear you, Alex, on that sort of hesitancy and people sometimes just not wanting to get too far out of their comfort zone or kind of take a risk or do something different. Robbie and Lauren, what are you seeing at your firm with regards to that?
Go ahead, Lauren.
No, you go.
One of the things that I had listed as a next action is having that non-negotiable discussion. I think it's really important to, before we start to piecemeal ideas and suggestions, and I think it's important to have an open, honest conversation with the leadership and the partners, and really start to outline the structure of where the parameters are and where their limits are. I think that will really start to help get us all on the same page first, and not have us use our time and energy chasing after things that aren't going to be obtainable for us.
Yeah, I think that what Robbie just said is a good point, and he said it to me like 10 different times, and it's something that for some reason doesn't stick with me, but every time you say it, it's so true. Like, because if we can have the conversation not about necessarily what we want, but about how far the partners of the firm are willing to push themselves, and where their comfort level is, and where they're willing to bend on that, and then where they're not. I think that'll give us kind of the freedom and a little more autonomy to build something that we're confident in. Because right now we don't necessarily know those limits. So I appreciate you saying that, Robbie, because I need the reminder again.
Yeah, and I'm seeing in the chat, Katie saying that they just had to submit a diversity plan to a customer. So I think that was in relation to the previous conversation about clients asking, even in interviews for projects. And then Michael Spain saying having uncomfortable conversations is a big part of reaching successful outcomes. So I think it is good to have that conversation of sort of like what, I think it's also important, and we do this a lot with our clients, is kind of preparing them for that discomfort. It's sort of like a doctor, like, this is going to hurt, or it's kind of a cliche, right? But like preparing people so they know what to expect, because when you don't name it, I think the fear builds up even more. So we do a lot of sort of scaffolding of leadership in preparing them for uncomfortable conversations and difficult feedback and things that they don't want to hear. Like I sometimes joke to my team, it's like we're hired to basically, so no one wants to hear, and then they want to fire us because they're like, wait, what do you mean? Like, we're sort of shooting the messenger. Thankfully, we have yet to actually be fired because of that, but sometimes I'm always like, but the reason is, right, you have to sort of hold on and know that the payoff is worth it, because that data is really valuable, sort of as I was saying before. And so if you can sit with the discomfort of having some of that feedback potentially, then you can kind of, it translates into kind of pure gold, I feel like, in terms of really knowing what can shift the dial. And I think partly with the resistance, sometimes it's about having that data to back you up. And leadership, I found, when it's just you speaking, right? And unfortunately, especially if you're a woman or a woman of color, it can feel like you're sort of screaming into the wind and trying to convince people and get them to see what we can see from our own lived experience. Whereas when we do have data and when they see it coming from multiple voices, I think that's where leadership kind of realized, like, oh, it is, you know, several people, more than just one, you know, it's not just Alethea over there or Alex over here or Lauren or Robbie or whoever, right? That there is, that this is a pattern that staff are experiencing and that we actually have a lot to gain from addressing it. So I think that's important. And I'm just reading Melanie's comment about this conversation wouldn't have taken place when I moved to Philadelphia in 2002. And honestly, I was listening to Stacey's video and her talking about the conversations they're having. I was last in the design industry in 2016, and these conversations were not happening at the firms that I worked at, even in 2016. I mean, I think AIA and IDA was starting to maybe host some of those, like outside of firms, there were starting to be some of those discussions, but at least at the firms I was at, it was never talked about. I don't think I ever talked about race once when I was in working for a design firm. Gender a little bit more, but it was just not, and it wasn't part, right? I've also evolved a lot in my willingness and skills and ability to talk about it as well. And now, you know, I do it for a living. So that's like it's a big shift over the last 5 years, but it is really different. And to hear that all of these firms are having these conversations at all is certainly progress. So we always talk about progress, not perfection. It doesn't mean there isn't a lot more work to do, but yes, thank you, Melanie. I do agree. I do agree with that. Robbie and Lauren, anything about challenges? Lauren, you already kind of mentioned earlier, kind of the challenge of people being busy and not having the time. So I think that is, so one of those oppressive characteristics is a sense of urgency. And we know that that is a huge thing in the design industry. Yeah. And so it can be really easy for these things to fall on the back burner when work gets busy. Lauren, do you want to talk a bit more about sort of that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that is not mine or Robbie's, you know, primary role in the firm. So this is something that we're kind of, you know, championing and trying to take on, and that's important to us, but our assignments don't involve it. So I think it's been challenging for the two of us to make moves. It's also been challenging, and this is something that maybe we could use some brainstorming or help with, but it's been challenging, at least for me. I have been hesitant to push forward with having more conversations with leadership in a time where we're so focused, the focus is on managing workload. And so, you know, my perspective is, it's not the right time. It's not what's considered most important right now. Like maybe we should wait and have this when things are like a little, there's a little more space. And that may be wrong. But it's something that like I've been challenged with, because it just feels like either it will be rejected or they'll be like, I don't know, like a little dismissive because of the state of things around here. So
Alex or Robbie, do you have any thoughts on that? Or I could jump into, but yeah, I just wanted to sort of open it up.
Given like cliche vibes, you know, and I think part of it is being a woman too. You're like being a bit like, oh, it's not the right time. But is there ever really a right time? It's like, if not now, then when? And you put it out there and you kind of you see what happens. You engage in the conversation, and if it's not, it'll quickly like manifest itself as such. But maybe somebody be like, you know what, Lauren? Yeah, let's do it.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
Yeah, I think one of the other things I've been thinking about too, as I've been reflecting, is Lauren and I are taking a lot of this on our shoulders, but we did set up a committee for a reason. And I think we haven't talked enough about delegating tasks and coming up with, you know, tangible data or selling points to come to the discussion with. So I think Lauren and I tend to just kind of take things on. And it might be a good opportunity for us to think about approaching that conversation and how other people can contribute to that and help facilitate it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that comes to mind for me is that, again, I think people think DEI is really about the D, the diversity of like, how do we hire people of more diverse backgrounds? And again, all of that is important. But I think if managing the workload is the priority, how can, so one of the principles that is really important in our work is involving people who are impacted by decisions in how those decisions are made. So if managing workload is the priority, how could that be not just a leadership responsibility, but how do you harness all staff in a conversation about what it would take to, and I don't know the details of what managing workload is, right? But like, what would it take, like what, because the staff who are on the ground doing that work have see how things work and have ideas for how things could be run more effectively, more efficiently, more productively. What if instead of that sort of more top-down decision-making model that we're all socialized into, what if there was a brainstorming session where staff got to give input on how to solve some of the issues that are top of mind for leadership, and that leadership, so that, right, like, so similar to you all that delegating and not just taking it on, I think leadership, and it's really out of good intentions, but I think leadership often really see it as their responsibility to fix everything and to manage everything. And that is a little bit of a paternalistic attitude and paternalism being assuming that we know better than others what's best for them. And part of creating inclusion is creating space and recognizing that everyone gets, like connecting people to their agency, and that we can make much better decisions when we're getting the input from people who are involved. So that would be one way that I think you could approach it, so it doesn't feel like, oh, this is something separate, or this is something different, but these new kind of or the shift that you have gone through in terms of understanding inclusion and observing and getting feedback and gathering data, that could be applied to any issue. It doesn't have to be directly a conversation about race, but that can, right, but identity comes in when you start to look at, well, who tends to be working the most overtime, or who tends to feel the most pressure, or who is doing a lot of the more mundane, repetitive tasks, or just, like things that may not seem to be about race or identity, and just kind of looking at, oftentimes women are the ones who are doing a lot of the administrative workload. Women are often in design firms more predominantly represented in project management. So there is sort of that emotional, invisible labor of taking care of clients and taking care of teams that often falls more on women and women of color. And so I think that that's how you can kind of make the conversation relevant to leadership and to the issues that are top of mind for them. And it also kind of creates the value proposition, right? As we talked about value proposition. Yes, Katie, making the coffee, organizing the birthday get together, like taking the notes in the meeting, like all of those things. And it kind of sounds a little bit like, as I'm saying those things, I'm like, we're still in this place, but we are still in this place where those tasks often fall more on women. And so I think generally, when you have really talented staff, they have a lot of really great ideas. And when you can tap into that leadership, suddenly it's like, oh, this is really, it's sort of, it really shifts, it gets them bought into the value of getting feedback, because they start to see that they can actually be better leaders and make better decisions when they've got that feedback.
Yeah,
so
that's great advice. Thank you. Padlet plug.
Yeah.
Can we talk about Padlet?
Yes.
Robbie and I never stop talking about Padlet. We haven't gotten it yet, but it is definitely on the 2022 to-do list. It's just it's a survey platform. It was new to me. We used it in the workshops, and us as a firm, we've like historically used SurveyMonkey, which a lot of people use. But Padlet is so cool because it is, thank you, see that link. It can be anonymous, and you can ask a very specific question, and then it kind of goes in as almost like a chat with little chat bubbles, and other individuals can upvote or comment on, but it's all anonymous. And it's a very cool environment that even if people are doing it in real time, it puts everybody at a level playing field. I loved it. I thought it was such an awesome tool. and definitely something that we want to use here. So I could see doing a brainstorming session like that, or hosting it in person and kind of having like a workshop type thing. But another good takeaway that I didn't mention earlier is that tool, Padlet.
Yes, a lot of people do end up adopting Padlet, and there are many different ways you can do it, but you can do, it's fun to do in a facilitated, in a live way. So you might say, so one of the ones we often do, actually, we often do takeaways. Like at the end of the workshop, we'll do, what are your biggest takeaways? And we'll do a Padlet, and then everyone is on, but they're all typing, and you see these little bubbles of people typing. And then the posts pop up, and then people can comment and chat. So it has that feel of a live conversation. But first of all, you can have a live conversation. So it's a little bit like the Zoom chat, but the Zoom chat is kind of hard to follow because it keeps sort of scrolling. So on Padlet, it's more visual, and you kind of have the post laid out a bit more. And it feels like a conversation. It's especially good when it's a larger group, because you can't really have a conversation with 50 people, say, or 100 people, right? If that's how big your firm is. But you can on Padlet have just a lot of posts going on. And then if you've got facilitators, we often will read out some of the comments or ask what questions, or just kind of sort of point out and uplift like patterns that we're seeing on it. So yes, I think we love Padlet. We use it a lot in workshops, and it's a great way to, and because it's anonymous, it's a great way to create that space. Surveys are great too. I think surveys are, right, a survey is an individual experience, right? You're just sitting there by yourself, reflecting, typing things in, and then it kind of goes into a black hole, and you hope that the company will share the results. That doesn't always happen. Whereas with Padlet, you get to see right away what your colleagues are saying, and you can interact and comment on one another. So it really is kind of a community building kind of a space as well. And I think for leadership, somehow it lands more viscerally because it is live and they're seeing it, versus sort of the more disembodied like survey results coming in. And Katie is asking, is it appropriate to send an anonymous survey and ask how employees identify? So yes, absolutely. I mean, we do that. We do that in surveys when we work with clients. It can help when there is a third party doing it, just because it feels a little bit safer to people sometimes in terms of anonymity. But yes, absolutely, you can do an anonymous survey, and you often just need a lot of sort of like, this is anonymous. This is like, you just have to do a lot of explanation about who gets to see the data and how the data is going to be used. So I do think it is really important with surveys. I always say the only thing worse than not doing a survey is doing a survey and not sharing the responses. And it is quite alarming how many companies do surveys and don't share the responses. And often it's not out of ill intent or anything like that. It takes a while to analyze surveys and to figure out how to present the results. But that really can affect morale, because people are like, well, what happened? Like, why aren't they sharing it? There must have been something really bad. Or why did I spend all that time giving input if we don't get to see it? So I think it's important to be really transparent about what the data is going to be used for and how it will be shared and when. So often in a survey, we'll even say, we'll be sharing the results with staff at a meeting on this date, and we'll have it already scheduled in calendar, so people just know that they're gonna see, even if it's a few months away. When we do big employee surveys, it may take a few months. We just did one with a client, I think in November, and we just shared the results today. So it's not a huge long time, but it's not like tomorrow we're sharing the results. But I think it's really good for people to know what's going to happen with it. So, all right, so we've got about 15 minutes left. Any other, like, what are some of your next steps, and what I'm sort of gonna, we had a couple of questions. I'm gonna sort of combine them a little bit. What are your next steps, and what recommendations would you have to others who are here today?
Just in terms of like recommendations, I want to piggyback off of something Lauren said earlier. Maybe Lauren and Robbie might have been like a combo, but just in terms of not letting yourself be overwhelmed about next steps, especially in our design jobs and firms. Like, we are design professionals. We are not trained EDI professionals. And a lot of times there's this invisible pressure for you to be the expert in this, and this is not our area of expertise. So being okay with sharing the burden with someone else, recommending to higher ups that we need to bring in a professional that actually is trained in this area, because it's you're spinning your wheels and it's ultimately not sustainable for you to do that. And then being okay with taking off small bits at a time. Maybe it's a matter of, so like in our company, we have mandatory sexual harassment training that happens. And our HR person looked at adding a DEI component. So there was more training around just EDI in the workplace. So maybe there's like little things that can be added that aren't an additional cost to the company. So starting first at things that aren't going to add additional costs, but then getting to it, because eventually you got to pay for something if you really believe it. But starting off with smaller things that are going to be free, tapping into resources. Like if you are involved with AIA or IIDA or any of these organizations that have already put out resources to our industry and to members, taking advantage of those things so you aren't spinning your wheels. You don't have to create a whole new idea. At this point, there's likely something already out there that you can tap into to use, and then doing it like a bite size, like a little bite, and then a bigger bite, and then you can build up from there.
Thanks, Alex. That is great advice. We definitely advocate for hiring a professional. It feels like it's a little bit self-serving. Doesn't have to be us, of course, but I think it is a real burden for staff to be trying to do it all internally themselves. And so often the trajectory is you do this grassroots efforts, the things that are internal, you build up the momentum enough to the point where leadership is willing to say, okay, we're ready to bring in a professional, often gathering data. Like oftentimes we're called in because the company has done a survey and they're like, oh my goodness, like we need help addressing some of the things that are coming up. But one of the things we do when we work with firms is kind of provide some relief for the volunteers and for the people that are doing it from internally and for whom it's not their full-time job. So definitely upvote that. Lauren or Robbie, what other recommendations?
Yeah, Alex really hit on so many of the things I was going to say. I think that was extremely well said. But I guess one of the other things that I would think about is trying, like I have imposter syndrome sometimes when I'm doing this stuff because I'm not an expert and I'm like, where do I start? But one of the things that helps me is to keep reminding myself that the fact that you're interested and wanting to be here and wanting to make change is something to celebrate. And that's a great start. And I think we also beat ourselves up over not making like gigantic leaps. So going back to what Lauren had said earlier and what you have taught us about making small changes and celebrating those small victories and small moments. I think then when you take a look back, you can really see the growth as opposed to trying to bite off more than you can chew and then feeling disappointed that you didn't get anywhere with it. So just little reminders to yourself that not only keep you honest and keep you motivated, but also just takes it easy on yourself.
Thanks, Robbie. I love that too. Lauren, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I definitely had those same recommendations. And then the other thing, I think this is a quote from you, Alethea. You had it in your presentation, but it struck a chord with me. And it's that actions speak louder than words and results speak louder than actions. I love that. Love it. Because I'm one of the people in the firm who has in the past issued surveys and analyzed the results and shared and made changes and stuff. And it made me realize just like the very simple thing that like I never went back and actually measured, like, did this really address what it needed to? So there's accountability. It's not just like making changes and doing, what you think is right, but actually going back and questioning was what you thought was right. So I think it just making sure you come full circle, and it's such a simple little quote to keep top of mind.
Thank you. I love that. I love when we came up with that, I was like, that's it. That's the thing. And I think that, right, being able to measure progress and really look at impact. So despite our best intentions, we're not always having the impact that we want. Mm-hmm. I think it's also important we don't, like sort of what you were saying, Robbie, we don't always have to have the answers. So I really like the word facilitator. And I most often will refer to myself as a facilitator because I don't want to, even though I have a certain level of expertise and experience, I don't want to come in as the expert with all the answers. That's not really co-creating inclusion. That's sort of still kind of working within that hierarchy of what's considered to be expertise. So I think thinking ourselves of, yes, as leaders, but really as facilitators and, right, like you said, observing, gathering data, creating the space for voices to be heard. I think that I hope that feels more manageable than sort of like, you know, and I think the rushing in to fix things. I think we're often socialized into, like, in various different ways, depending on identity, we're socialized into thinking that we have to have the answer or the solution or the fix. And sometimes having that approach can actually be more damaging than helpful. We may not have the best answer. So thank you all. I know that earlier, I think it was Catherine was interested in talking more about the pipeline. So I don't know if she's still here. I think she may have had to jump off. But I'm also happy. I feel like that is like a whole, oh, it was Katie. Was it Katie that you asked about the pipeline? Oh, I'm looking through. Katie, do you want to unmute and sort of a sort of tell us a bit more about what you are interested in discussing with regards to pipeline?
Yeah, for sure. And we can definitely make a whole nother call about this issue.
Yes, we absolutely can.
So, Chatham University in Pittsburgh, I'm on the advisory committee, and we're just starting a new subcommittee called DEI. And I'm going to head it up, which is scary. But I mean, the problem is we don't have a big pipeline for diversity in interior design. Most interior designers look like me. I'm a white woman. So right now I'm just trying to gather information on how do we make our, and we kind of have the opposite problem with the gender, because we've always been, well, a lot of times we've been female, you know, imbalanced. So I want to get more males involved. I want to get definitely different colors involved, black, brown. Yeah, absolutely. That is definitely, how do we get in front of city schools and say, hey, you could be an interior designer. I can't stand there and do that. I don't look like the people we want to recruit. So, you know, there's a lot of things to think about. And I would love to have just as much input as I could possibly get.
So you're talking about even at the higher ed level, how are you getting high school students into college level? Or
Yeah, how do we get high school students interested in design? How to walk them through the process of applying to a college? How do we get them scholarships? Maybe they can't afford it. How do we get them a mentor in their first couple of years of professional practice? So much to think about. And
it is a big, huge question. And do any of the panelists wanna weigh in?
I'm going to take a stab, and then I'm also going to put Michael Spain on the spot, because here in Philly, he's involved with the Center for Architecture and Design. And I know this past year, our firm has participated in this architecture education program. We were going into third grade classrooms and talking to students about architecture and design. So I feel like there's definitely some room for him to share expertise. But again, when I talk about my own interests and having been interested in design and architecture since I was a child, and both my parents were teachers. So they were like, yeah, sure, whatever. Like, I'm like, part of it is being fortunate enough to have parents that understand and value creative careers, even if they don't necessarily relate directly. I know sometimes in minority communities, there's hesitancy for jobs that you don't think will make money. They're like, oh no, you'll be a nurse, or you'll go into like marketing or business management or whatever, because that feels what's more tangible, because they don't have that representation. So all that to say is, for me, I was fortunate enough to have parents that were supportive, and I went to a high school that was specifically focused on architecture and design. So for me, it just like luckily fell into place. But since after that happened, and since I've gone to college where there's less representation, and then going to work where there's even less representation, I make it a point to get involved with like ACE Mentors, for example, which is an organization that focuses on exposing high school students to careers in architecture, construction, and engineering. So finding existing organizations or volunteer organizations that have some sort of relationship already established with schools, especially for you, Katie, so you don't necessarily have to create like nothing new. I'm big on like tapping into resources that already exist, so because it's less overwhelming than trying to create everything on your own. And then finding what organizations exist in Pittsburgh that can help you get into even elementary or middle schools, Philly, we're fortunate enough, like I think a few organizations here, like Fresh Artists is an organization that exposes specifically 7th graders to creative careers. So that's design, architecture, cooking, photography, like all of these things. So finding an organization that's already tapping into youth to expose them to careers that are looking different than what they may be typical. And then once you've tapped into that, then you can kind of borrow some parts and pieces and be able to expand upon that. But first, find something that's already existing so you don't get overwhelmed.
Hi, it's
Yeah.
Leslie.
Go ahead, Leslie. Yeah, but
Hi.
I totally agree with tapping into existing resources. Yeah, Leslie, go ahead.
This is a resource for everybody. It's called Design Your World. It's an IIDA educational pipeline program. And they target an educational pipeline program for high school students. I'm with 3Form, and my VP of sales is on the committee with Cheryl Durst. So it is a very active program, and they brought a bunch of high school students from Chicago to Neocon and did a whole walkthrough at the MARD and showed them and educated them. OFS is on it, Mannington is on it, and we supply them with, and there's a lot more manufacturers, and we supply the students with samples and try to get them in, promoting interior design. So if you want to look at that, I would probably start there, tap into that. It's called Design Your World.
Thanks,
from
Leslie.
IIDA.
Anyone else on the call? Michael, Alex kind of tapped you, so. Michael? Looked like you unmuted. I can't hear you though. Okay, Michael, if you can come on, let us know. I think there are a lot of great programs that are reaching out to elementary, middle, high school students. I personally also think that the profession has to change to be more relevant to a wider range of people. And like I went to Pratt in the 90s, and yes, it was Brooklyn, but it was pretty diverse then, both for race and gender. And there's just such a drain to the pipe, right? Like even when you have that pipeline at college level, there's just such a drain at every level of the profession. And for me, it's sort of disappointing to see that level of diversity that I experienced at college hasn't really completely, I mean, I think it's shifted a little bit, but it hasn't really changed. And I went back to Pratt to talk, and like half my professors from the 90s are still there. Not any dig at Pratt. Love Pratt, had a great time at Pratt. But the profession is slow to change and our institutions are slow to change. And I really feel that both architecture and interior design also have to not just attract people into the profession as it is now, but also have to shift to show that we are relevant to a wider range of interests, that it's not just luxury design for rich white people in big, and that it is relevant to all of the things that people, like the wider range of issues and interests that people are interested. Like, the younger generation's social impact is something that is really important. They're not going to be interested in a profession that does not appear to be taking social impact seriously. And I do think the design and architecture professions, I feel like having put 20 years into the profession, I can say this, that the profession we're behind some other profession. We're behind a lot of our clients' industries in terms of really taking this seriously. And I do think there have been wake-up calls, but there's still a lot more that can be done. So seeing a lot. Yes, Michael, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks, Alex, for mentioning me. So I am the Director of Design Education at the Center for Architecture and Design, and we have a K through 12 architectural program that introduces students, particularly BIPOC and Latinx students, to the design professions across the board. And the way we do that is by going into these schools. And I have to say, Francis Coughlin has been a really good partner, giving us 10 volunteers in one school to teach kids about the process and the exposure of design, because we can talk about the pipeline and making them fresh and growing this, but also what you guys have talked about, if it leads to a toxic work environment where all that fresh pipeline is leading to, what's the benefit? So that program, again, looks to expose kids to that, support them through elementary school, middle school, high school, and then college, where there's also the challenge of students being supported in their academics and even just the social aspects that they have to face that might be a little bit greater than some of the others. Jade PHL, if you guys check it out, is another consortium that's been started that has higher education professionals, industry professionals, designers that have formed this consortium to kind of address that particular issue also. So thanks for that, Alex. And this has been great, nice hearing, and also seeing Robbie and Lauren again after almost a year of being apart from them. And it seems like the D2 is in great hands.
Thanks,
Okay,
Mike.
so I do want to be mindful of time. If anyone wants to chat a little bit more afterwards, I'm happy to do that. One thing I just want to invite you all to is that we are actually doing another series of workshops. So if any of you are like, oh, I wish I'd been at those workshops, we're doing another series of workshops with IIDA New York Equity Council. So I'm going to put that link in the chat. It's slightly different. It's actually 4 3-hour workshops spread over 6 or 7 months. So there is some overlap with what we did before. So I feel like there's better, right? There's pros and cons. I really liked sort of it was like a crash course with us. We did it in like two, I think it was 2 3-hour workshops, but they were a week apart. So it was sort of a intense dive. IIDA Equity Council actually has a pledge, a EDI JEDI pledge that firms can sign up for to show their commitment to JEDI. And there are some different pillars and different metrics for assessment. And I believe that's open to any firms, not just New York firms. So I know this is like a state over, but we would love to have any of you there at that workshop session. And I just really want to thank Chisenia and your team for hosting, and to thank all of our panelists, Alex, Robbie, and Lauren, and also Stacey, who couldn't be here, but who made that great video for us. So thank you, everyone. And thank you for everyone who came, anyone who's listening to the recording. Thank you for your interest also. We will put out, and Michael, thanks for putting your email in the chat. We will, Chisenia, I'll be in touch, and we can put some links in a follow-up email as well, so people can have access to some of those resources. So thank you. Chisenia, do you want to close out with any other comments?
No, I think you guys all really covered a lot. This was great listening to you all, having gone through the initial talk back in June and the workshops, and just seeing how everything has come together and the progress. No progress is too small to share. So this is very inspiring. I thank you all for joining us, and thank you all the attendees. And yeah, if you guys want to know more, or interested, I think the New York chapter, what they're putting, would be a great opportunity.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Signe, good to see you again. Yes, that was a few years ago now, the Women's Leadership Summit.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.